Welcome back to the Convo Couch, everyone. Pastor Jardula here. Got a great show for you today. As you know, the Convo Couch was just in Nicaragua observing those elections, and I met some kick-ass journalists there. So, with all the propaganda going on from the mainstream media and all the politicians in the West saying this was a pantomime election and Daniel Ortega's a dictator and his people don't love him or like him, I thought I'd bring in some awesome reporters and journalists that I met on the ground to say, what the fuck are you talking about, mainstream media and Western media, as well as the politicians? So with us today, you can see my man from Press TV, Ahmed Kaballo's here. How you doing, Ahmed?
I'm good. I'm excited about the fact that I can cuss on TV. This is the first for me. So let's go.
It's the reason why I can't get a job with these networks like you guys, because I curse too much. So it might be a blessing today, but it's a curse for me. So you know what? Curse away any chance you get. Also from Sputnik Radio, my man, he pissed off Keith Olbermann like there's no telling like tomorrow. I've been trying to piss off and get this guy's attention for 4 years, but Wyatt got it just like that. Wyatt Reed from Sputnik. What's up, Wyatt?
Hey man, glad to be here. I think it might be he just wanted it too bad. As he could smell that. He could smell that. But trained. What we learned from the best here at Sputnik. So we're basically dedicated 24 hours to pissing off Keith Olbermann. So.
You did a great job at it. It's pretty awesome. And the whole thing about it, the context of the tweet, I thought was amazing. It was awesome because it really pushed back against the narrative of what the mainstream media is talking about. So let's just dive right into this and let's go over a few things that we have to say. What the fuck are you talking about over there? Because there's a lot of propaganda out there. Would you not agree, boys, that there's a ton of propaganda? And from what we experienced in Nicaragua, that they're getting it all wrong, but they're getting all wrong on purpose. No, Ahmed?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there was quite a few people from North America there to cover the elections to observe. But I was the only journalist, only reporter from the UK. There was a second reporter that was meant to join me, and he got detained by the Mexican authorities. That was Steve Sweeney. But no one else joined, and there's no excuses. You can enter Nicaragua for 90 days without a visa. So them not being there was a choice. They could have come there on a tourist visa. They could have gone around. They could have interviewed whoever they liked. The police, we didn't see heavy police presence on the streets. It was a choice, and the reason why they didn't go there is because they wanted to kind of write a preconceived narrative that follows exactly what the U.S. State Department says, what the U.S. Secretary of State says, what the U.S. President says.
Why? What is your opinion on that? Because a lot of people were really confused that Steve Sweeney got held up in Mexico and never made it to Nicaragua because AMLO's the president there now, and he's more of a populist, a leftist, a socialist president. That was a guy who wasn't part of the major parties in Mexico for like the last 90 years to make it as a president. And a lot of people say he was a president for the people. Why do you think that Steve Sweeney got all held up there?
Look, it's impossible to say for sure. Definitely a bunch of rumors circulating. There was some sense that Steve Sweeney's been like a very pro Kurdish independence kind of voice, that maybe this had something to do with Turkey in some way, using some kind of international influence. We don't actually really know, I don't think, but in general, yeah, you're right. Obviously the Mexican government, definitely left of center, definitely very pro Latin America sort of regional integration. They obviously effectively rescued Evo Morales from the coup mongers just a couple years ago, and reports even that they had to evade an RPG at the time from these just crazed fascists, which is seized power in Bolivia. But when it comes to Nicaragua, it's been a little bit hit or miss. AMLO's been he's made some statements before that are difficult for me to defend. I will say at the very least they abstained from this OAS vote, attacking Nicaragua. So that's part of the puzzle for sure. Obviously, it's a complicated relationship when it involves things like immigration too. You're talking about a country that lives next door to the most powerful military power on planet Earth. their hands are tied in some ways. I don't know how much of this was international politics and how much of this was. I just I'm the wrong one to ask about that one, I think.
You got a great opinion about it, but a lot of people say, and I don't want to use the term deep state, but the Mexican intelligence apparatus has been there for a long time and has a lot of loyalty to the West. They work with the West. So a lot of people said it was kind of out of AMLO's hands. He was able to pull the triggers, like you said, you mentioned with Evo Morales, but in this particular situation, it's just one of those things that the president that comes in can't just wave a magic wand and change everything. So it was quite confusing, but it did suck that Steve Sweeney was detained. And I understand he was detained for like several days too, as well, like stuck in a room, wasn't given phone calls, was complaining about his conditions there. Not that they were like, in a cell, waterboarding him or anything like that. But once again, very inconvenient without reason too. That's the whole thing. Without any reason or explanation, it sucks. Let's jump into this, ladies and gentlemen. Well, there's no ladies with us. Gentlemen and gentlemen, let's jump into this. What I put to the mainstream media and our corrupt government with their bullshit propaganda to push an imperialist agenda, we say, what the fuck are you talking about with this idea that Daniel Ortega eliminated his competition and jailed his oppositions? I have an article up I put up from Counterpunch. Ben Norton has done some great work on this. Ahmed, I'm going to give you the first shot on this. What do you have to say to this bullshit that they're saying the reason that Daniel Ortega won this election because he jailed and eliminated his opponents? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, they say that a lie can go around the world before the truth has a chance to put its trousers up. And this is just another example. If it's a lie that's regurgitated over and over again, no one ever does any digging, no one ever does any investigation. And the people that were detained were not presidential candidates. And the reason that they were detained would constitute a crime in any country in the world, particularly the United States. You can't receive foreign funding. You can't receive foreign funding for political activities. You can't pretend to be an NGO, but use that money to orchestrate violence. And something that's completely missing from the mainstream media is the 2018 violent coup. Now, I went to Messiah. I met somebody who had to have his arm amputated because he was tortured by these right-wing gangs. That a lot of them were not even from Nicaragua. They were coming from El Salvador, Honduras, and they tortured him. And then when they realized they tortured him so bad, they did a video where they said, look what the Sandinistas did to this man. And he just sat there like some sort of hostage and had to plung, because had he said anything else, then he would have got tortured even more. He then waited for the guys, then took him to some paramedics because they had paramedics on site. He then was not properly treated by the paramedics. He wanted to go to the hospital, but to get to the hospital, he realized he would have had to cross seven to eight checkpoints. And he felt that to cross those 7 or 8 checkpoints meant that he would endure more violence and might even be killed. So his arm got infected and eventually had to be amputated. And this is a story that's completely missing. Now, we mentioned Bolivia previously. I spoke to Camilla, who was in Bolivia recently, and she explained that amongst the movement towards socialism, grassroots, there's a lot of anger that some of the people that orchestrated the coup in Bolivia got away with it. They left the country, they escaped justice. And amongst the Sandinista movement, there was the same kind of desire to see the people that were instrumental in the misery, in the rape, in the torture, in the closing down of towns, cities, and roads. People want to see them punished. Now, there was an amnesty, but these people went back after the amnesty and continued some of the same actions that started the 2018. So what 2018 coup? So what is the government meant to do? What's the judicial system meant to do? And let these people get away with it just to not suffer the wrath of the United States. It wouldn't be in the spirit of the country. It wouldn't be in the spirit of the resistance of the country from Sandino to the present day for them not to kind of stand up for their sovereignty, for their independence, and for what's right.
Daniel Ortega handled this situation so smart. I mean, I wouldn't be able to show that type of restraint. We're talking about these people, justice. I often talk about, what the Italians did to Benito Mussolini as an example to not do this stuff again. But I think that Daniel Ortega knew that the international community would belittle him and demonize him if he took any type of revenge, or even just try to, I don't want to say take revenge, but just let justice play out, right? These people, they were, guilty of rape, murder. You're just talking a story about a guy getting his arm amputated. Wyatt, you talk a lot about the 2018 coup and whatnot, and that led to what happened in 2020 with some of these people who did take these monies from these NGOs. I believe it was the Chamorro Foundation that was taking money backdoor from USAID and maybe the NED. Your thoughts, and you've talked about this before. Give us a bit of your mind when it comes to this sentiment that Daniel Ortega jailed his competition, and that's why he won.
Yeah, absolutely. You're talking about the Chamorro Foundation. This is directly linked to the Chamorro family, which is one of the richest families in all of Nicaragua historically and to this day. Specifically, the woman who is kind of held up in Western media, her name is Cristiana Chamorro, the daughter of Violeta Chamorro. So she is basically the same. If you want to think about her as kind of a potential Juan Guaido that didn't quite make it to the finish line, that's a good way to think about it.
That's a great analogy.
And this is what we witnessed this past year. This is why the Western press, that obviously no one ever flinches when Saudi Arabia declines to have elections year after year after year after year at all. But all of a sudden, we have a great respect for the sanctity of the Central American democratic process after ignoring all sorts of horrific irregularities in Honduras for years, not obviously making them, call new elections in 2016 after Juan Orlando Hernandez, the horrific narco dictator, openly flips the election on the backs of shutting down the computer system for 36 hours. When it comes back on, he has a significant advantage where he's losing before. There was no insistence on having new elections then by the part of the OAS. I mean, they asked for them, then Honduras declined, and that was that. The U.S. didn't force the issue. The U.S. instead, in the aftermath of those elections, called for national unity and healing, all types of things that you don't see them saying about this particular election in Nicaragua. Although obviously that it would be for the best if Nicaragua were allowed to actually go through this process of national healing, national unity that I think most Nicaraguans want. Specifically going back to the Chamorro Foundation in 2018, this is a big player in terms of the distribution of monies. Chamorro, one of a number of figures who was essentially serving as a back channel between CIA cutout money and the tranqueros, the actual, in many cases, really just like gang members that were overseeing these so-called tranques, these roadblocks that were set up originally in the West, Managua and Masaya, but then sort of transferred out as kind of a virus is what it was seen as by a lot of Nicaraguans. And they turned the country into something totally ungovernable. They turned it into complete chaos, complete anarchy. Anyone who wanted to go anywhere was extorted constantly by the people at these roadblocks at the very best. That was the best case scenario. The best case scenario is, I keep my head down, I make it through this, I just pay this guy the couple bucks that he wants. He doesn't take an interest in me. He doesn't take an interest in my daughter. He doesn't take an interest in going through my stuff. He doesn't want to look through and see if I might potentially have some Sandinista sympathies, because if he does, he's gonna take me out and torture me, and he's gonna record it. They're gonna send it to their friends. And actually, for as horrific as that was, I will say, me and Ahmed had the chance to speak with the daughter of a man named Bismarck Martinez, who's now kind of seen as a big hero in Nicaragua. He's kind of a legend. And that was how we found out about, his execution, was because the so-called democratic peaceful opposition was filming themselves as they tortured and executed people like Bismarck Martinez. We found out, as his daughter told us, that he had been on his way to see them in Jinotepe, and he was stopped at one of these roadblocks, and they saw either depending on something that was on his shirt, or it was they went through his wallet. I've heard a couple stories, but no one really knows exactly how they determined, you know, he was a Sandinista. So they pulled him out, you know, beat him. They're blasting they're like sarcastically singing Sandinista anthems at him, just like really, and they're saying, you know, he's some kind of psychological training. They're saying you're a psychologist, like you should, you know, analyze this. Like, tell me, you know, what does this make me feel like? What's going through your head now? You know, just like really horrible, sort of depraved kind of things. This was happening all over the country, and this is what people don't realize. And these are the people who were facilitating that are now getting in trouble. And you know, people I think are pleased, and as Ahmed said, you know, there are people who wish that more people had paid more of a price, but there's also an understanding that you know, personal vengeance isn't worth, national unity isn't worth sacrificing the ability of all Nicaraguans to kind of collectively advance together, which, you know, I think is a beautiful impulse. It's probably a mature impulse, maybe not the one that I personally like would, you know, even feel comfortable with, but I'm happy that some people are able and willing to show that kind of restraint.
Yeah, and if I could just briefly add to that.
Go ahead.
So when I was filming, I had a cameraman with me. I don't know if Wyatt saw him, but he was extremely large, very kind of overweight, possibly the laziest cameraman I've ever met. Every 5 minutes, he wants to take a seat and have something to eat and have something to drink. And this is going somewhere, by the way. Anyway, so I'm with him, and all he does is joke and laugh, and he's just about having a good time and eating good food. And on the last day, when we was in Messiah, and we interviewed this Ronaldo, I think his name is, the guy who had his arm amputated. While we're sitting there having some iced tea and talking, he then tells Ronaldo that he organized his friends in his neighborhood to then kick out these kind of violent gangs. And he said the last straw for himself was these opposition groups had called for all businesses to close. And there was a company that was selling furniture, and the guy that was selling furniture refused to close down his shop. So because he refused to close down his shop, him and his family were set alight in their house. So that news caused such anger that this guy, who, with respect, doesn't want to do anything ever, decided to organize him and his friends to get rid of these roadblocks and get rid of these thugs from the community. And that speaks to why the Sandinistas got 75% of the vote. It speaks to why there was a 65% turnout. It speaks to why, when you look at the polls, the majority of the nation, even if they don't support the government, they support the security measures, because everyone's life was made hell. And it reminds me of when I was in Venezuela, the similar sentiment that I got about the garimbas and the roadblocks that were set up there. There were some people that opposed the government, but they opposed the opposition, the violent right-wing opposition, even more, because they made their lives hell. They put their...
Well, I'll follow up on that.
Please, let's see if he comes back in. That was getting so juicy. You know, this is the reason why I wanted to have you guys on the show, because you guys have the goods on the 2018 coup that a lot of people just kind of gloss over, and they don't really hold the West accountable. Please piggyback on that, and hopefully we'll get Ahmed back.
Well, we got him back.
There you are, Ahmed.
Here we go, Ahmed. We lost a little bit.
Sorry, man. I don't know if that was Secretary Blinken or what was going on. How come my Wi-Fi?
When you got Press TV, Sputnik, and the Convo Couch together on one show, the deep state's going to be zapping us. But please continue, because I was just telling Wyatt, this is why I was so excited to have you guys on the show, because people gloss over the 2018 in the West. They don't know about it. They don't understand it. Did we lose him again? Oh, there you are. They don't understand it. They don't know about it, and they don't understand how they made some laws and why it directly impacted this election. Go ahead. Yeah,
I'm just turning on my hotspot so that we can sort this situation. I think I've got Wi-Fi issue. Yes, I was saying that people don't realize that these fascist groups, because that's what they are, the measures that they use, the measure that they used against Orlando Figueroa in Venezuela, where they set a black man on fire. When they use these tactics, it of course doesn't draw any more support. It isolates them, and it isolates the entity that supports them. So in Venezuela, there was, I think it was 86% polls against US intervention, against sanctions, because they realize that this entity that calls itself the United States of America doesn't have their best interests at heart. It clearly doesn't. Nicaragua has a history where these guys were supporting child raping Contras in the 80s. So, of course, that's within people's lifetime. That's within people's memory. They know that in 2021, when they say they're trying to promote democracy and human rights, but yet refuse to pay reparations for the crimes they've done in the past, people don't believe them.
They don't. Why? Do you have anything else to say before we go down to the next topic?
Well, no, the comparison with Venezuela is so on point, and it's also important to highlight, and this is another thing that's totally glossed over in the mainstream media, that these governments are popular, not even necessarily because they're like, able to overcome these colossal odds and these horrific economic war that are being waged against them, but it's more because like they are actual instruments by which people are able to improve their daily lives and improve their conditions. And that's how, whereas here political parties are effectively like meant to capture they're there to capture popular discontent and to cap it and prevent it from actually doing anything. It's the opposite there, where like the political party is meant to empower the working people to actually be able to get increases in their standards of living.
Is on.
And we went to Bilwi, in this city. We saw the city that was only a few months out, really, a year away, less than a year from these back-to-back hurricanes, and it didn't look like it had been hit by hurricanes at all. And when you find out about what actually happened during the course of those hurricanes, it's incredible. Because right across the river, you have massive flooding in Honduras when these hurricanes hit. Dozens of lives being lost. You have like the airports flooding, and you're getting viral videos of this going, out across the world. You see just night and day the difference between how those hurricanes were handled in Honduras, which is, a neoliberal client state of the U.S. empire, which is what they wanted to turn Nicaragua into, which is what Nicaragua would be if they had succeeded in 2018. And that was the goal, right? To destroy all this progress, to walk back all these gains, to just carve it out so it's open for business, open for the highest bidder, open for neoliberalism, open for complete privatization of everything. That's the goal. And you see how that worked out on a natural response basis. And when because I actually spoke with the ambassador, the Nicaraguan ambassador to the U.S., Francisco Campbell, and he is from the coast. And I spoke to him, after the hurricanes hit, and just wanted to get a sense, like, how does Nicaragua manage this? Like, how did you guys get to do such a good response on this? And he explained it in much the same way that I'm explaining to you now, because Nicaraguans view the government as an extension of themselves. They view it not as some top-down thing, but they understand like there is a mutual relationship here where like we are working through the mechanism of this government to empower ourselves, to take care of ourselves and our neighbors. So they mobilized tens of thousands of Sandinista Party members too. They mobilized whole communities themselves. People themselves are being involved in the operations. They're not being extracted by people. They themselves are helping do the extractions of their neighbors. Oh, where's that person? Where's this neighbor? Everybody knows. And they also have 4 times annual drills that are totally dependent where you are in the country on which kind of drill you're doing. Over In Leon, they're doing volcano drills, you know, earthquake drills. Over here, they're doing hurricane drills, flooding drills, you know. But it's like a very holistic approach that fits within this like socialist democratic model that enables people to help themselves.
Yeah, and the way they ran the elections too, you know, they trained together, they were out there in force. I was talking about this the other day. You know, in a polling station in California, you may get 5 to 10 people who work in that sucker. You got close to 100 people working or volunteering in the very first place we went to in Bilby, the very first voting center. And we saw that was one of the busiest and the longest it took someone, 8 minutes and 43 seconds to vote, you know. But the funny thing about the 2018 coup, and there's nothing funny about a deadly coup, but the West overplayed their hands. You know, they went all in, they pushed all in with a jack high, and the Sandinista government and with Daniel Ortega called them. And that's why they were trying to desperately try to kind of push their propaganda and try to create this narrative that just wasn't true. Because after 2018, they made a law, which meant that every single type of candidate or anybody within the government had to disclose where they're getting their funding from, you know, whether it be these NGOs and the NED. And we saw a lot of these groups getting these money from these Western forces. And the great thing about it is they made a law which now permitted them for doing it. It was very much like the same law that Beijing made with Hong Kong. Only the fact is that they kind of mirrored the FARA Act in the United States. So if the West were going, well, how can you make a law like that? That's unjust. It's like, what are you talking about? We made a law similar to what you got in the United States there. We're doing the same thing that you guys are doing. I think that's what the genius thing about this was. And we all know these weren't serious candidates. They called them pre-candidates, right? I mean, not for nothing, Ahmed, I'm going to make you the pre-candidate to be the prime minister of Britain. So how about that? You know what I'm saying? Anybody could say that. But the last thing I want to talk about this subject, and you can go first on this, Ahmed, is you talked about this in your first statement about nobody reads past the headlines. They don't look at the nuance of what's going on. Why is that? And what can we do to push through so people will understand when they make these bullshit statements about Nicaragua's pre-candidates, they'll call bullshit right away.
Yeah, I mean, part of the battle is this argument that there's legitimate media and illegitimate media. So someone will look at what me and Wyatt say and you guys say, and they'll say, well, that's Sputnik, Russia. This is Press TV, Iran. This is, I don't know, independent media. What they'll use that to disparage what we say, and they'll take what the CNN and BBC say as objective truth. Now, what our battle is to show that actually what the BBC says, the clues in the name, British Broadcast Channel, isn't independent. What the CNN says isn't independent. What MSNBC, New York Times says, they all have their own interest, and their interest is aligned to that of the United States State Department. Because I think this battle is more, it's not just about resources. It's not just about demonizing the Daniel Ortega government. It's about what that system represents. It represents independence. It represents a different economic model, and different economic model that they would never want to see implemented in the United States. Now, what I noticed living in London, the demonization of Latin American socialist countries intensified during the Corbyn years. And they use that to say, if you vote for Jeremy Corbyn, you're going to get Venezuela. If you vote for Jeremy Corbyn, you're going to get Cuba. So it's more about what that system represents, what that system of government represents, what people power represents. And there's no way they want that to come and interfere with their corporate interests in the United States, in the United Kingdom, France, Germany, etc.
It's funny because the boogeyman for the conservatives and the patriots in America is socialism. It's communism. Even when Donald Trump gets up there, socialism, communism, he says it's the same thing, which it's not. They buy it. They play into it. You know, they think that capitalism is all about choices. But I always talk about a mixed economy, right? Like, we can still have our choices. The thing we really need to fear is authoritarianism. You know what I'm saying? Too much control at the top. And I get that. But, you know, this system right over here in play, I think that you're right, Ahmed. that the West doesn't want their own citizens seeing that a socialist government can thrive and it can give people health care, it can give people education, it can make sure that everybody has a standard of living that is not, the floor is not too low, where we don't have close to 700,000 homeless people in the United States, and yet the conservatives and the patriots still buy into it. Wyatt, you want to say anything to wrap that up? Because I know you have an opinion about maybe socialism and the system compared to capitalism.
Absolutely. I mean, y'all hit a bunch of the notes that I would have harped on as well. But let's leave it at that, I guess. Capitalism is constantly looking to open up new markets for exploitation. Imperialism, what the U.S. does to Latin America and indeed to the rest of the world, is, as Vladimir Lenin said, the highest stage of capitalism. So we see right now kind of the empire reaching its limits, reaching its outer limits in terms of the countries that it was able to successfully turn back into neo-colonies. They failed in Syria. They're failing in Iran. They're failing in Venezuela. They're failing in Cuba. And so I think, they're turning back now to Nicaragua, familiar foe. And, I think right now it's kind of like, well, there's always, a little colonialism left in the Nicaragua stand, so they obviously failed in 2018 here, right? Failed in Bolivia. They're failing everywhere they're going. They're trying to turn countries that have kicked the Yankee boot heel off, and it's not working out. So we see them going back to the same playbook of just economic sanctions, economic isolation. They want to turn the world back into like a Cold War era reality where everyone has to pick a side. But it's not going to be that easy. China especially is so intertwined in global commerce. It's now the wealthiest country in the world. They're not going to be able to dominate and bully the global South in the way that they once were and be able to force them back into the arms of U.S. imperialism. I don't think it's going to be a compelling selling point. I don't think we're at a moment in time, where people who have lived in these countries, who have gotten a taste of what it's like to live outside of that, really gonna want to go back. So I think that's bad news for like the wealthy elite in the U.S. and in the Europe, and good news for literally everyone else.
Yeah, it remains to be seen what the United States is going to do, because I'm a little bit nervous. The Renouncer Act, nobody spoke up against it. You know what I'm saying? And I want to hear, the squad voted against it, but they didn't make one friggin' tweet about it. They didn't call a press conference. They didn't talk about, how these sanctions are going to kill the most vulnerable people. Instead, you got cucks like Rokfin going, well, these are more targeted sanctions. And there's no such thing as a targeted sanction. It affects the poor, the most vulnerable, period. Sanctions are an act of war, and we shouldn't be doing so. Whether it's about the fact that the Russians are going to come in, that's what they're scared about, or it's the fact that they can't plant the IMF and the central banks all over Nicaragua and thrust crony capitalism everywhere. Whatever the case may be, whether they're afraid for the Western people to see how a socialist government can actually succeed, I don't care. We should stay out, and I'm very upset that there's no politicians in the West calling this out whatsoever. We have no friends in Washington. Zero. Let's get to the next point real quick, because I want to say, what the fuck are you talking about, Western media, when it comes to this idea that Daniel Ortega didn't allow his competition to properly promote themselves. And Wyatt, I'm going to start with you on this one, because this is the Keith Olbermann part. You put up a great tweet, and this was from Natalie Kitroff, who we called out on the ground, works for New York Times, saying that they were arresting all credible challengers, shutting down opposition parties, banning large campaign events, and closing voting stations en masse. I think she made that tweet from her desk in Long Island. Who knows? But it wasn't true. And you put up this great tweet, Wyatt. I know it's simple, and people will go, well, that's just simple, but it meant so much. In the fantasy Nicaragua, invented by the New York Times, there are no billboards or campaign posters featuring anyone else other than Daniel Ortega. Meanwhile, in real life, there are literally hundreds of opposition banners hanging throughout Managua. you're bilingual. You speak great Spanish. You were actually one of the translators when we went to Billy with my partners, Fee and John. Tell us about what you saw as far as opposition promotions out there.
We saw the same level of opposition promotion that you see every year. That you saw the same parties, the PLC. Those were the PLI. That was the specific party that we saw represented in those banners that I posted. But you also saw the ALN. You saw a number of parties with big banners hanging out throughout Managua. This was obviously a lie, and I took those photos before I saw that tweet because I knew it was coming. You know, I could just have you start to cover enough of these little countries.
You know
that
their
are
playbook. You know what they're gonna do. They're very consistent. They run the same fucking playbook, even when it fails. Go ahead, buddy.
Yeah, so I suspected somebody would say something like, "Oh, the opposition isn't even allowed to do this or that," and lo and behold, gave me just the perfect opening for that one for sure. So I posted that. It went a little bit viral. I think people are always happy to see like the New York Times proven wrong. It's just like proven that they just don't even do like the most basic fact checking or journalism if it comes to a country that the U.S. foreign policy establishment doesn't like. Then it's just like, all bets are off. No rules apply. Say whatever you want. No one will ever call you out on it. If they do, it doesn't matter. You'll never face any professional consequences at all. So, but what we can do now is we can give them like social media consequences. We can like unleash our hordes of like anti-imperialist supporters on them.
But they're even shutting that down, right? They're shutting us down. They're suspending our accounts. They're shadow banning as we go after these cucks.
Because Keith Olbermann, that's why he attacked me, right? Obviously, he's not able to prove me wrong on the actual truth of the matter. So he made this tweet. I don't know why he thought this was a good idea, but he woke up at 4 a.m. and said, like, I'm gonna just choose violence today or whatever, as they say on Twitter. And he called me, quote, he said, "What's it like to be a whore of a dictator?"
Yeah.
And,
a whore for a dictator.
Which, I guess I wasn't sure. Is he trying to refer to Daniel Ortega? Is he referring to Vladimir Putin? Unclear. I might ask for clarification at some point, but I just quote tweeted him. I said, "What's it like to be ratioed by an actual journalist?" And the people loved it. Everyone loves a good ratio, especially on Keith Olbermann, who's just like such a ridiculous tool and so like uniquely hateable because he's like self-loathing and like he thinks like his Russian heritage is like a stain on his family. So yeah, that was the highlight of the day. Keith Olbermann like unintentionally ended up driving just hundreds of thousands of views to my tweets. Like we got like 500,000 views on that tweet because like Keith Olbermann decided to, open his mouth and do a little tweeting a little too early in the morning.
Yeah, Ahmed, what do you think the mindset is of these people like Keith Olbermann and these other guys who just play ball? Is it all just? I mean, is there something inside them as a journalist or as a political commentator that's got to be pushing back against the fact that they're the actual whores, right? They're actually whoring out for the State Department. What do you think it's like, the psychology going on in their mind?
Me and Wyatt actually discussed this because I was going to put up a tweet saying, well, you got $30 million from MSNBC. So if Wyatt's a whore, then you're a high-end escort. But Wyatt gave me a friendly kind of a bit of advice and says, don't put that up. Don't put that up. You'll have the feminists attacking you. I was like, okay, yeah, you're probably right. But yeah, it's either delusion or I don't know. Is it groupthink? Is it just because everyone else in his circle thinks the same way? So they never met anyone like us that can kind of pierce that preconceived narrative that they have during every single regime change project that the United States supports. I actually don't know the answer to that question. You guys, I mean, Wyatt lives in Washington. He's probably bumped into these figures a lot more than me. I've never met anyone like that before. I've never had a conversation. It's very difficult to get into their psyche to understand exactly what motivates them to say what they say. Maybe he believes it, and if he does believe it, I kind of feel sorry for him, because imagine believing every statement that comes out of the White House as being gospel truth.
We got to put the
it's a sad state of affairs.
We got to put up the photo of him literally wrapping himself in the U.S. flag. Like, I mean, it's actually wild. Like, I think that's like that's like a real time footage of like what he sees. You know, what the inside of Keith Olbermann's little brain is just like, you know, save me, America, from like the evil Russian menace, from the evil Nicaraguan dictators. Like, I don't know, he's like a child. You know, he's like a spoiled child that's never had to face, I don't know, professional consequences, because every time he like loses a job, he just like fails upwards and ends up with another ridiculously high paid job. I don't know. And you were talking about the double standards bit. I should have mentioned, because Danny Haifong, another like real solid journalist, he said the exact same thing. He said, like, what's it like to get that ratio because you whore for the American oligarchy, right? And he got suspended for 12 hours for hateful conduct. Well, his tweet is still up. You know, it's just like this obvious double standards where the rules are just made up as they go along. They apply to some people, they apply to others, you know, not at all. And he's in the blue check category where just like no rules apply, say whatever you want. But I guess that's not enough yet to protect you from getting ratioed, unfortunately.
You know, it's crazy because, you know, Natalie Kitroff wasn't there. Keith Olbermann wasn't there. We were on the ground. I had a friend of ours who shared one of our videos and they labeled it as misinformation. And they're like, how can you label it as misinformation? They're actually on the ground in fucking Nicaragua over here. What are you, crazy and stuff? But the reason why I opened up this line of question, you know, and Ahmed, you said you have no idea what's going on in their mind. I mean, we can guess a little bit, right? Everybody has a price. But when it comes to Keith Olbermann, you know, he had money as an ESPN analysis when he took this commentating job or whatnot. So I'm really just trying to figure out the psychology, because I know one way to combat it is us getting on the ground, actually going there and doing actual journalism. But another part is really finding out what's going on in their heads. Is it just about dollars and cents? Because if we do understand exactly what they are thinking, if it is groupthink or whatnot, then we need to expose it. And we need to expose it a lot to everybody out there so people will understand, who's watching all that stuff, that they're just doing this, you know, to be a good servant for their masters. You want to say anything else, Ahmed?
Yeah, I mean, although he's relatively harmless, he has quite a lot of followers that believe what he says. So we're not actually speaking to him. He's wrapped up in the US flag. He's beyond speaking to, but we're speaking to everyone else that follows him, that believes what he says to be truth and believes that he has some sort of legitimacy. And that is the battle. And I think despite their best efforts to kind of censor us and censor anyone else that has a different point of view to that of the US State Department, we are winning that battle when it comes to social media. Every single kind of back and forth with someone like Keith and someone like Wyatt, you can see in the comments which side the general public's on. So it's good. If the more they engage us, the better chance we have of convincing people on their side of what we're actually saying and showing them some of the facts and figures from the ground.
You giving me permission to keep poking at Keith Olbermann. I like your statement. I'm going to keep going at him. Try to get some more back and forth. Like I said, for 4 years, I've been trying to get this asshole's attention. Wyatt puts up a post and gets it like that. I'm jealous of you, pal.
Yeah, just to add to that, I had a BBC journalist have a go at me while I was in Venezuela, and the same thing happened. Oh no!
Tell us about it.
Oh, you can see me. I thought the internet went.
No, we
can see you. You're there.
I'm still here. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I had a back and forth with a BBC journalist called Orla Gering. She's basically shipped off to all of the different regime change projects from Syria to Yemen to Venezuela to basically do the British Foreign Office bidding. And I don't know how it started. It wasn't me. Someone tagged me in her Twitter feed, And then she said, whatever we do at the BBC, we don't do propaganda, insinuating that what I was doing was propaganda. So I did this long Twitter thread highlighting different reports. And yeah, it was brilliant. I mean, I got a lot more followers from it, but more importantly than that, a lot of the people that followed her got to see a different point of view, something that's completely missing from any of her reports, from any of her coverage. So this is a great kind of space for us to use and use it to kind of to show people the other side of the story that's blatantly missing and blatantly distorted by the mainstream media.
You know, it sucks for me because, you know, I got in a little tussle with a couple left-leaning writers around election time, you know what I'm saying? But I'm waiting for those big hardcore mainstream media guys to come after me. I'm dying for them to come after me. Maybe I'll get them. I mean, I think Business Insider was my first step. You know what I'm saying? Like I think his name was Charles Davis, who kind of smeared me and went after me. But, you know, I'm still jealous that Wyatt, he landed the big fish in Keith Olbermann. But let's get on to the next question, because this is a good one right now. And I'm going to let you start off with this, Wyatt. What the fuck is this whole idea that the Sandinistas and the dictator Daniel Ortega are a repressive government and its people don't support him or love him? I was on the ground there. We talked to so many people. Their lives have improved so much over the last 15 years when it came to Daniel Ortega. You lived there. Can you push back at this idea that this guy is just a dictator and people don't love him?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Nicaragua is like any country on planet Earth. You have people who like the government, people who don't care, and people who dislike the government. And like every country on Earth, those percentages have like very little to do with what percentages we're presented with in mainstream media. You know, obviously they want to downplay the overwhelming support that Daniel Ortega has, especially in certain parts of the country where they've just been able to really dramatically shift people's lives around. It's something that's hard to put into words, I think. And especially hard to put into words for people who live in the U.S. who haven't really seen what it's like to live without running water, without access to power 24 hours a day, without a refrigerator, with an inability to preserve food. You know, it's reflected though in much of the global South in just sort of basic day-to-day things. People will eat certain kinds of cheese because like, oh, this preserves better. You know, like you don't need to store it in the cold. So, you know, like even it's reflected in ways that, you know, again, just hard to put into words how people go around addressing these conditions that they live in and what it's like when a government comes along that actually tries to increase all their standards of living like this, that actually tries to extend these life-changing technologies to as many people as possible, that actually goes about completing these vast electrification campaigns that, you know, we were all in. Bill, we know just a week before they were finally made it onto the central grid, you know, the grid that plugs into all of Central America. They finally, when I was there 10 years ago, man, it was not a nice place to be. Nothing was paved. It was all just mud everywhere. Like everything was made of wood and it's all kind of rotting, and tarps for roofs, you know, just not good standards of living. 10 years later, it's like a city, and there's power. There's street lights up at night, you know, shining things up. It's, you know, just night and day. They had just gotten access to running water, which again, just like if you haven't lived without running water, you don't really understand what that means to not have to go spend, you know, an hour a day going and filling that up, bringing that back, going, you know, some days you can't do it, or like, you know, what it means to not have to worry about parasites in that water, for your children, you know, just there's so many little parts to what this government has been doing that it's so hard to explain to people who haven't been in the conditions that most working Nicaraguans were used to for decades, really for since 500 years ago, since colonization began. So that, I guess, that's something that we saw, and I think that is important that we continue to put out there as much as we can. Showing why it is that so many people in Nicaragua support this government. I was able to talk to a number of people just in Managua who were recipients of the Casa Solidaria. They've given away nearly 10,000 of them, just completely free of charge to people who are really struggling. Meanwhile, I know, I think of both of you guys, I know Ahmed at least was able to go to the Bismarck Martinez project, this massive housing program that's being put together, named after Bismarck Martinez, who we spoke about earlier, who was tortured by the coup mongers in 2018. This is going to see the creation of 50,000 subsidized or low-income homes that will be able to house 250,000 people, right? And that's a lot of the population. We're talking about a country with a 6 million population. That's not something that's insignificant,
That's in Bilby, right?
Well, that's in Managua, but mainly,
okay.
But 20,000 of those houses are going to be built in Managua by the end of 2025. 30,000 going to be built in the rest of the country. So a total of 50,000 homes under that particular program, but that's just one program, And I spoke to talked about Operation Miracle, where they, I met a guy who had his sight restored because they removed the cataracts from his eyes. All these people are recipients of the Paquete Solidaria. They get these shipments, much like people in Venezuela get the clap boxes. They get the shipments of food that help them take care of, single mothers, help them take care of their kids. And this is not even to mention what it's like to have access to, the hundreds of healthcare clinics, dozens of hospitals that have been built over the past decade and a half. And it's all free of charge. The healthcare is free. We can't somehow have that in the most, so-called most developed nation on planet Earth. But there in little old Nicaragua, they figured out a way to pay for it.
I think the love for Daniel Ortega definitely has to do with, number one, he's a strong leader. And when it comes to, I asked Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos yesterday, who was on the show, about why, people like Putin and Lukashenko and Ortega are really kept in power for so long, is because a lot of the citizens understand what the West is trying to do. And they like these strong leaders, but also they want their country to continue on with their economic process. Housing, education, healthcare, but also what they're doing in Managua over there by the water is just beautiful. And with Bilwi now, this could be a tourist location that would be great for people to go to from the United States, just and put that money into that country. So therefore they can enrich the people and they can pull them out of extreme poverty, which they're already starting to do. So Ahmed, you went to Bilwi too as well. And I saw you with a construction hat on and doing some pointing around over there. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you saw and why that really leads to the fact that the people of Nicaragua, even in the autonomous zone of Bilwi, support that government?
Yeah, I'll start with the back end of your question first. Okay. As citizens, why do you pay tax? You pay tax because you want to see the government improve your lives and provide security. And in Nicaragua, the murder rate is 7 per 100,000. In Honduras, which is right next door, it's 44 per 100,000. So they clearly provide security and they clearly improve the lives of the citizens. Free healthcare, as Wyatt has mentioned, free education. I drove, you guys were fortunate enough to go via plane. I drove to Bilwi, which meant that it was a 10-hour trip. But I'm fortunate that I took this trip in 2021 because I was told, had I took this trip just 5-6 years ago, it would have took 3 days. Mm-hmm. So that's just a clear example of some of the development. There's a major highway being built that's going to connect Bilwi to the rest of the country. Well, I went to, you saw me with a construction hat. There was a hospital, state-of-the-art hospital that cost $56 million that was being built. That was not just for Bilwi, but for the surrounding areas. The previous hospital that was built during the neoliberal era was built from timber. I mean, it's obvious why people can see the material differences to their lives. I was told that there was some sort of construction done during the neoliberal era, but unfortunately, it was all done by the church and the NGO. The government was nowhere to be seen. When communities were flattened by earthquakes or hurricanes or any other sort of natural disaster, they were left flattened. There was no concern. There was no kind of understanding that we need these people as much as they need us. And it's precisely because of that. I think for the second Sandinista government that's come in 2007, that was elected in 2006, came out in 2007, the reason why they've got so much support, because they had 16 years of neoliberal era. They got to see what a neoliberal US-backed model provides them, and it's absolutely nothing. When there were hurricanes, the government would use that as an excuse to socially and ethnically cleanse an area of so-called undesirables. And these are things that I didn't know before I went to Nicaragua. These are the things that people told me. People told me in Spanish, people told me in Mosquito, people told me in various different ways how they felt and why development was their primary goal. I know in the global north, we focus on other things, but when you live in the global south, believe me when I say this, development is your main priority. 56% of the country was connected to electrical grid in 2006. It's now 96%. That's a massive improvement in people's lives. 9% of young people that were educated in the school system went on to university. It's now 19%. These are dramatic increases. Maternal deaths has decreased dramatically. Infant mortality has decreased. Any sort of social index that you can think of has improved. And for
education,
people
education. Sergio told us about back in the days, if you don't have the money for the uniform, you can't go to school. But when the Sandinista government took over, they made sure you had the uniform so you can go to school. I'm sorry for interrupting. Keep going, Ahmed.
Sergio reminded me, Sergio also said when he went to school in the neoliberal era, he had to bring his own chair to the classroom. He had to carry his own chair to the classroom to sit down on. And it just shows the kind of priorities in a country where most of the people are peasant farmers. They want to see some sort of support from their government, and the Nicaraguan government has provided that support. It's also provided relative safety when you compare it to their neighbors of El Salvador and Honduras and any other Central American country. And that is primarily the reason why Daniel Ortega and the Sandinista movement have the support. It's not because he's a Chavez type guy and he's full of charisma. It's because of policies. It's because of policies, infrastructure, and development.
Yeah. And Wyatt, 95% food efficient right now. I believe that Nicaragua exports a lot of beef to Florida. So when these sanctions kick in, I wonder how these people in Florida, when they ain't getting their steaks on their plate, think about socialism then.
Well, I certainly hope. Yeah, I mean, I hope it bites them in the ass harder than that. But I really like, that's kind of the issue with sanctions. From my perspective, I don't know how many more countries that the U.S. will be able to sanction and still be able to like actually get all the things it wants to import from the rest of the world. I mean, it's at least like a third of the planet is under, sanctions now. So we'll see. Obviously they just announced more sanctions, so-called targeted sanctions. Although I don't really, to me it reminds me of targeted drone strikes. It's like, okay,
exactly. They're the great analogy.
Right. You're perfect. Like you're really precise with them. Like my issue was like the lack of precision with the imperialism. I wanted more precise imperialism. Like, no,
we're not killing the right people. We got to do it better.
Right. Yeah. And that's there's this whole strain of like, it's like the Rokanas, as you were saying, it's like the liberal so-called left, like, we share the same thing. We're both critical of sanctions, but it's like, well, I'm critical of attempts to like economically isolate whole peoples, and you're critical of like, the effectiveness of this at creating regime change. Like, no, this is not the same. We're not having the same conversation. But anyway, so in terms of like the sanctions, obviously the threat here really is that they want to start opening the process, looking towards a future where they can kick out Nicaragua from DR-CAFTA, from the Central American Free Trade Agreement that facilitates trade in the region, but mainly it facilitates U.S. Nicaraguan trade, right? The U.S. is the #1 destination for Nicaraguan exports. So when we're talking about doing something like this, I mean, the U.S. can't unilaterally kick them out of CAFTA. I think they need 2/3 plus one of the signatories to be able to remove somebody. I have to double check that, but that's not, it's not nothing. You know what I mean? But I see that as something like that is a necessary first step for the U.S. to go down if they really want to try to strangle the Nicaraguan economy the same way that they have done like the Venezuelan economy, right? Because you can't be like sanctioning countries that you have maintaining free trade agreements with. You know, I don't think. I mean, logistics aside, it's not like a really particularly good optic for anybody who wants to consider signing a free trade agreement with you in the future. But I see that as kind of that's the big threat here with the Renacer thing, is not that they're actually going to kick them out of CAFTA just yet, but that is now on the horizon. That is now what is occupying the thoughts of, you know, a whole bunch of State Department toadies and Treasury Department, you know, bean counters. Is like now they're thinking about, oh, you know, how are we gonna kick them out so that we can turn them into like another Cuba or another Venezuela in the public imagination.
It doesn't matter who's in that White House: Bill Clinton, Obama, Trump, now Joe Zombie Biden, right? It's the same type of attitude. It's the same imperialist bullshit. Now Joe Biden says that Daniel Ortega and any Nicaraguan diplomats can't come to the United States. And in fact, they're not just sanctioning Sandinistas in the government, they're sanctioning their families. Ahmed, anything else to say before we wrap up on this subject? Because let me just tell you this much, too. You guys know where I feel. Like, you got 7 active volcanoes. If they want to take it to the next level, I think they should mine Bitcoin, turn it right into cash. And I wish to God they would tap into marijuana. I really wish they would just make, you know, marijuana toilet paper and export it to the world and make all these products out of it, not just for, you know, the THC and smoking, you know, aspect of it, but I wish they would just tap into that freaking resource and make Nicaragua explode. Ahmed, finish it up.
Yeah, I mean, Wyatt mentioned it. I think there's 27 countries and territories around the world that are now currently being sanctioned by the United States. That's not a smart tactic, because that means those 27 countries can all trade with each other. Before, when Cuba was blockaded after the fall of the Soviet Union, Cuba didn't have too many allies which it could trade with, and it did cause a lot of economic misery to the people of Cuba. But now, countries like Venezuela can receive oil from Iran, can receive gas from Russia, can receive financial support from China, can receive agricultural goods from Nicaragua. It's creating some sort of other polar that's a challenge to the US's unipolar system that it wants to enforce on the rest of the world. So I don't think it's actually that smart. And I think if there was someone a bit sharper in the White House than Sleepy Joe, then maybe he might realize it. But yet they persist. Now, in regards to the sanction regime and the support from liberals, they support it with some of the talking points. Whenever I'm talking about Nicaragua with some of my friends in London, they always bring up things like, yeah, but what about abortion rights? Or, yeah, what about things that are never being discussed in Nicaragua? Now, when you say, yeah, but, you are, by the back door, legitimizing sanctions. Sanctions should be opposed, regardless of what you think of these issues. It's collective punishment, unilateral coercive measures. If you know what those 3 words mean together, you would never support it. But they use this kind of language that flies over the layman's head because they know that most people don't understand what unilateral coercive measures means. There was 2 million people on the streets of London to protest against the Iraq war, when 40,000 people are killed in Venezuela in 2017 alone, there is no one marching in London. The demonstrations have 20, 30, 40, 50 people because they don't understand what sanctions are and the effect that they have. Now, you mentioned that Nicaragua is 95% food sovereign. So I don't think it will have the same effect that it has on Venezuela. But that's not the point. The United States aims and its intention is for it to have the same effect, is for it to cause collective punishment so that people turn on the government. And I think that's something that needs to be realized by people that support it.
That's a great point, Ahmed. And Sergio told us that Daniel Ortega and the Sandinista government knew that this day was coming, and they were preparing for it, and they were getting ready for it. But the thing that scares me is that I think the U.S., and I said this yesterday, they need to start changing their tactics. They can't bully anybody anymore. They can't put the chokehold anymore. They should look at what China's doing. They come in, let us help you build stuff. Let's create a relationship that way, financially and economically, not military-wise, and forcing their way on people and stuff. But the thing that scares me is I think the West is caught up to this now, and they realize that they've played their last card. Like I said, they've pushed all in with Jack High and got called. So I'm scared that they might manufacture consent with a false flag situation, and then all of a sudden, drones, boots on the ground, something like that. I'm very nervous of that happening. You guys got any thoughts to that, Wyatt, of something that, that's the feeling I got. I was like, they're not going to sit back and go easy step by step like they did in Venezuela, where they failed miserably. It might be strike hard, strike fast, no mercy, sir. Your thoughts?
Well, I guess the only pushback I might offer on that is that Nicaragua still never quite, I don't know, it never quite reached to the same level. Obviously, under Reagan, kind of was like an all bets are off situation where it's just like, okay, they're going to pretend that Nicaragua is an existential threat to the U.S. I don't want to say like there's no historical precedent here. That's obviously not the case. But just in terms of like real world, like, I don't know what they would gain from it so much as they would with like you take over Venezuela, like obviously like there's a whole bunch of oil to be gained. You know what I mean? I don't think maybe the motivation for just like a hot war with Nicaragua would be quite the same. Especially considering like Nicaragua is one of the only two countries that has ever kicked out the Marines. I don't know whether they want to go back for more.
The thing is that the military-industrial complex has a lot of influence on our government, right? So every time they drop a bomb, they get paid for that. You know what I'm saying? And I do believe the West is starting to develop this, well, I'm just going to take my ball and go home kind of mentality, meaning that, all right, if you guys aren't going to comply, then we're just going to ruin your infrastructure and then bounce the hell on out. Ahmed, anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. When I traveled through Venezuela, taxi drivers would ask me, do you think we're going to be invaded? Do you think we're going to be invaded? And my simple answer all the time was, you're not a Muslim country. It's a lot more difficult to demonize whole scale groups of people in Latin America as it is in the Muslim country. When it comes to Afghanistan, everyone's the Taliban. When it comes to Iraq, they're all supporters of Saddam. It's easier to demonize these groups to justify invasion. It's very difficult to demonize a Latin American socialist country to the same level. We're not in the Cold War, although we are moving that way. The term communist or socialist, although it is still relatively toxic in the mainstream media, it doesn't carry the same level of toxicity that it once did. So I do think that a hot war on the ground is unlikely because of that. Because to justify a war, you literally, like the Viet Cong in Vietnam, you literally need to turn not just the leadership into persona non grata, but the whole civilian population as well. I think that's a very difficult thing to do in Latin America.
That's a great point. Let me see if Wyatt's coming back in. Let me touch this real quick, see if this helps. Back on 1 second. Doesn't work. This is it. No, not now. Hold on. Sorry.
No problem.
Well, let's get to the last part real quick, and we'll, since Wyatt just fell off, maybe he'll jump back in. But if
Just
not,
one final point on that.
Oh, go ahead. Do you want to make a
Just
final
one
point?
final point on the hot war.
Go ahead, buddy.
Yeah. So also in recent experience, a hot war doesn't actually work. So Iraq, after the Iraq war, we see an explosion of terrorist groups, ISIS, al-Nusra, a bunch of jihadi alphabet groups that have taken over, which might have been the intention in the first place, who knows? But more crucially than that, Iraq's not even a US client state like they expect it to be. It's now aligned with Iran, Hezbollah. Its parliament voted 2/3 to kick out the Yankees. There's now mass protests on the streets to get the US out. So the US invasion of which the intention is to turn these countries into client states doesn't even work the same way it did. Afghanistan, the United States just left made the Taliban one of the best armed armies in the world, leaving all sorts of helicopters and fighter jets and RPG missiles and all sorts in the country. So maybe there is a realization in the kind of the military industrial complex that a US war, when's the last time the United States actually won a hot war or at least achieved its objectives? I don't know if it's in recent memory. Can you tell me?
No, I wouldn't know off the top of my head. I mean, I guess the last successful act of military aggression was in Panama when they were able to get Noriega and replant their dictator puppet. But Ahmed, here's the thing that I believe. I believe that the U.S. doesn't care who wins the war. They don't care who loses the war. All they care about is if they have the war. Because even though they failed in nation building, like in all those countries you mentioned, the military industrial companies like Raytheon, like Boeing, like Northrop Grumman, they made millions and billions of dollars. So even though they didn't succeed in nation building, all these people got uber rich. Dick Cheney's and his family will never have to worry a day in their life. That's why it's so bizarre when I see Liz Cheney up there yapping her mouth when her father was one of the biggest warmongers, and yet despite them losing what they said the goal was, nation building, they still made billions of dollars. So that's why I wouldn't put it past the West to do something in Nicaragua, because maybe they might not push out the Sandinista government and Daniel Ortega, but they'll make a lot of money doing so and selling weapons to the oppositions once they bomb the hell out of the country.
So just to jump in, I agree with everything being said here, and especially, do y'all remember in 2011 Julian Assange had this great analysis of the Afghanistan war, and he said, quote, "The goal is to use Afghanistan to wash money out of the tax bases of the US and Europe through Afghanistan and back into the hands of a transnational security elite. The goal is an endless war, not a successful war." Like, yeah, true. But that was Afghanistan. And I will say the difference with Afghanistan is that you could manufacture a consent for continued occupation of Afghanistan under the guise of like this terrorist threat thing. Like the Osama bin Laden factor isn't really there with Nicaragua, where it's just like, and I mean, obviously on some level they're trying to create it. They're trying to create this like monster of like, oh, the evil Daniel Ortega something needs to be done about him. But we're certainly not at the level of like, hysteria that was like a post 9/11 reality, where it's like, okay, we're just like looking for someone to bomb. Everybody's like, hand over the heart, salute the flag, God bless America. Disney Channel coming in with like, that's so Raven, like, I love my flag and my country, and so do all my friends. Like we're not at that point, I think, where we can just like jump into a hot war in Nicaragua. But I guess I see your point about like, what if there's like some kind of
They're trying though, Wyatt, the second most popular Republican in the country. Okay. What's his name? He's the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis. This guy has been such a gusano. He's been speaking about, we shouldn't be praising Che Guevara. We should be praising the guy who killed him, and just capitulating and pandering, pandering to these people in South Florida for votes. You know what I'm saying? Saying that Cuba was the whole problem that we never handled. now Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas are a major problem, almost acting like we got to go wash our hands of this. This guy is, if Trump doesn't run, or if Trump does run, they think he might be the vice president. Like I said, he's the second most popular Republican in the country right now. And he's almost like jockeying for war in Latin America. Ahmed, do you want to say anything to finish on up?
Yeah, I mean, you make a very powerful point, which is about the lobby groups. We have lobby groups in the United Kingdom, but they pale in comparison to the lobby groups in the United States, which dictate domestic policy, foreign policy, gun policy, every sort of policy that you could think of is dictated by how powerful the lobby group is that's demanding this and that. So with the kind of the Cuban exile lobby group, which is concerned with all of the quote unquote troika of tyranny, Venezuela, Cuba, Cuba, and Nicaragua, it could happen because it was clear that a lot of Donald Trump's obsession with Latin America was trying to please this kind of Florida lobby of the Marco Rubios, the people in Latin America and Venezuela called Narco Rubio, that kind of contingency. So based on that alone, something could happen. Probably not a hot war, but maybe some sort of Syrian type supporting gangs from neighboring countries to come like they did in 2018. But 2018 was such a massive effort that I don't know. Would they try it again anytime soon? Who knows?
All eyes on Honduras in their election on the 28th. Zelaya running. Manuel Zelaya's wife. We understood what a populist leftist president he was. And when I say left and right, I don't mean United States West left and right. That's bullshit compared to left and right in Latin America. Left and right has a whole different meaning in Latin America than it does in the United States. You know what I'm saying? In the United States, it's all about culture wars and the thought police. You know what I'm saying? And a bunch of right-wingers that might say a bunch of shit but won't do shit, right? You get to Latin America, you better watch your ass with a right-winger over there. Like we saw in 2018. They will kill you. You know what I'm saying? And they will have it so they'll torture you that you need to get your arm amputated. So, I mean, it's going to be an interesting situation. I really do see the West losing their grip there. And I hope to God the military-industrial complex doesn't start something because, they're manufacturing consent on the right. You talked about Narco Rubio. Well, Ted Cruz is another one. So you got all the popular Republicans on the right are anti-Latin American freedom. You know what I'm saying? So we got to keep our eyes and our ears open because I don't think they're going to take this lying down, the military-industrial complex. And they're trying to do everything. Even the left is buying into this bullshit. You know what I'm saying? If you listen to Debbie Wasserman Schultz speak or any of her other goons, you know what I'm saying? Whether it Nancy Pelosi, they brought Juan Guaido to the floor of fucking Congress and gave this asshole a standing ovation. All right? All of them. Yeah. Democrats, Republicans, they stood up and applauded this guy. So I'm nervous, guys. And I hope to God that we make it past this. I would wish on everything holy that they would just change their ways, the West, and do business the way China does. I mean, it's 2021. How long are you going to keep getting your ass kicked? Anything else, guys, before we get to the next part?
Well, I say it's just, I don't think it's really in the DNA, like it's not something that they can really wrap their minds around, like a relationship that's not based on unilateral coercive measures. Just like, imagine if I like I came up, oh no, I didn't rob that guy. I just unilaterally coerced him into giving me his wallet and didn't want to die. He gave it up. Yeah. That's just a unilateral coercive measure. Like in any other context, unilateral coercive measure is just, I mean, I don't know. Sorry, go ahead.
No, there's a problem that we have in the UK and the US where during the Thatcher and the Reagan years, all of the industries were shipped off overseas. So now we're in a situation where the United States and the UK doesn't produce anything apart from weapons and war. So in a weird way, the economic incentive to stop invading, occupying, and destabilizing these countries isn't there, because what else have they got to fall back on? Detroit in the United States is like a ghost town from my understanding. I've never been there. From what I've read, they don't make cars the way they used to. Birmingham, where I'm from, which is equivalent of Detroit, don't make cars. 300,000 people in Birmingham used to make Land Rover and Rover. Now that factory has 3,000 workers. So unless there's a process of bringing some of these jobs back or making stuff in the United States, United Kingdom, then we're going to have this perpetual war and perpetual desire for war, because it brings jobs, it brings money through the military industrial complex. Although it brings the money to a very small group of elite, they're the elite that run the shots and they're the elite that run the show.
I said the only way we're getting saved is if I get that Rick and Morty spacesuit. When, you know, I don't know if y'all saw that episode when they were on the planet when they had the purge and they gave the poor girl the suit of armor, like the spacesuit. And it's like, you know, you elites have been taking advantage of these people all along. So I gave her a spacesuit, which is kind of equivalent to all the bullshit you guys did. And she wiped out all the oligarchs and the elites, because that's the only way this is going to happen. I'm not saying wipe it out, but just take away power from these people. And, you know, we've had this discussion before. You know, you guys think we know who they are. I still think a lot of them remain in the shadows and they're pulling strings and we don't know who they are. But that remains to be seen, and we can only just keep our eyes and ears open. And to my audience out there, this is the reason why we do the show. These were boots on the ground. You're not going to get this perspective in the mainstream media. Wyatt lived there for a while. Ahmed just did some amazing work and some interviews, and we'll get to talk about at the very end. But let's get to the last part, because this is what the fuck is the mainstream media and our Congress and our politicians in the United States talking about when they call this election a sham. Joe Biden calling it a pantomime election. I almost fell off my fucking chair. You want to talk about sham shit elections? Look at the elections in the United States. They say they were closing down polls left and right and that people were oppressed and they couldn't vote. We were on the ground. Ahmed, you did a little piece. You talked about enthusiasm, that there wouldn't be the enthusiasm of election if it wasn't a fair election. Give us more to what you're saying about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've voted in the UK in 5 elections, including the EU referendum election, and I've never in my life seen someone being carried in a wheelchair to the voting booth. I've never seen old people on a Zimmer frame walking less than a mile per hour. Very slow to the voting booth. That shows you enthusiasm. We saw the vote. We saw the queues. We saw that despite the fact that it was a Sunday, which is a religious day in a very conservative religious country, people were out there voting, and they just wouldn't do that. There wouldn't be 65% of people participating in the electoral process if they thought it was a foregone conclusion. I drove 10 hours from Managua to Bilwi, and then another 6 hours from Bilwi to West Bam, which is on the border of Honduras. In that drive, we stopped off several times. Every time I stopped off, I looked to see the shopkeeper's hand. Every single one of them had their thumb imprinted with ink, which suggested that they voted. I didn't bump into any Nicaraguans that I didn't see with their thumb imprinted with ink. How is it possible? How is it possible that all these people voted in and they thought it was a sham election? They thought there was no point of voting. They wouldn't do it. And not only if the people on the ground thought it was a sham election, where were the protests? There was no protest. We went. You guys were in Bilwi. I was in Chinandega. There was no protest. Where were if there were in 2020, the US presidential election, we saw what happened when a small proportion of the country felt that the election was a sham and that it was illegitimate. Whether you agree with it, they demonstrated their anger. Where was the January the 6th anger against the electoral process in Nicaragua? Well, it didn't exist. It didn't exist.
And Wyatt, you went. We were all in Bilwi together. We were the 10 chosen to go over there. We were together. You were in the room when the Convo Couch and a couple other people, and we were asking question after question after question after question. We gave the guy no softballs. We asked direct questions, and they answered them with confidence. They answered them like they knew what was going on. They were very proud of their elections process. and don't just take the Convo Couch's word for it. Wyatt, from what you saw on the ground after what we experienced in that room, going over every aspect of the election, from the registration to the voting process to the tabulation, what are your thoughts? Was this a sham election, or was this a real election?
This is a real election. I mean, it's just it's kind of like, it's like something where they like what they say about like North Korea or something, where it's just like they just assume that nobody will know any better, at this point. They just assume that they can get away with making these crazy claims like, oh, everybody's like brainwashed, or like they're all in it together. There's some big like media conspiracy. It's just like, do you really think they have the resources to like go out and put on like convince all these people to like pretend to have voted and like to pretend to actually like if they had the resources to convince people like to participate in like some massive like production, like they wouldn't be needing to take international loans from many other countries. They wouldn't they would be not the second poorest country in the hemisphere. Like they would be in a different league. Like, no, what we saw were actual elections. We saw this participation of every party that has historically been a participant in Nicaraguan elections. The only people who weren't allowed to participate were the people who have been plotting a return to violent coup tactics, who were participants in this horrific coup in 2018. And they were not allowed to participate as presidential candidates because you can't participate in an election when you're like under arrest for having tried to overthrow the government. That's a
fair rule, I think. You try to overthrow the government, you can't run in the election. I think that's fair.
I can't even imagine it here, but it's just like, do you think any of these there's more people locked up here in the US for that like ridiculous like clown show on January 6th than there are in Nicaragua for having actually tried to overthrow the government.
I know.
Yeah.
And these people here are getting longer sentences.
These people aren't even, they're not even getting to speak to their lawyers. Some people are still locked up from January 6th when they got arrested, and they're being held. Still, there's like over 30 people. It is crazy. And also too, what you said, like it would have to be, I don't think Houdini could have fixed this election. It would have to be the largest production of all times to get all these people on the same page. I mean, we saw over 500 volunteer and poll workers in 4 different spots. You know what I'm saying? To pull something off like that, and not to mention the expediency of this election, how you can get in and out. In America, they always talk about, you got to make our elections more accessible. You got to make our elections more accessible. Well, part of that is making sure you don't have to wait for 5 to 7 hours to fucking vote like people did in UCLA, in Santa Monica, in the California primary 2020. Whereas if we saw people get in and out 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes at the busiest location, 8 minutes and 43 seconds. Did you experience the same thing at your polling places, Ahmed, that me and Wyatt did when we visited Bilwi?
Yeah, and the polling stations were so close to each other. Yeah. So you didn't have heavy congestion at one polling station because there was another polling station, literally 3 to 4 minute walk down the road. So when I have to vote in the UK, even as a journalist, so my job is part of this. I have to go early in the morning before I start the shift. And you have to go early in the morning, know that you're going to be working all day long. They do everything in their power to discourage you from voting. In Nicaragua, voting's on a Sunday. Even if it wasn't on a Sunday, it's a national holiday. People don't have anything else to do. Universities are closed, so people can make their way down from their university towns to vote back in their hometown. This doesn't happen. When I was at university, I had to come back to Birmingham to vote. And then when I came back to Birmingham to vote, it was during a weekday. So I'd have to kind of miss a lecture to put my ex next to a ballot that I thought was worth doing. And if I didn't feel strongly about it, I'm probably not inclined to do that. So I just think it's a bit rich. I mean, until recently, the United States had universally low turnout. It was only the last couple of elections where the turnout's been a bit better. But for them to kind of patronize and kind of dictate to other countries about sham elections when historically in the United States, am I right in thinking most elections are decided by 40 something percent of the population? In Nicaragua, it was 65%. I know the recent elections was higher than that, but if you check the United States voting history, it's usually around 45-50% of the electorate that vote.
And yeah, I'm gonna let you go really quick. Just want to mention that there's no mail-in voting. There's no drop boxes out in the middle of nowhere. You need to show ID to vote, and then they mark your thumb with ink, and they allow all the parties in the room. We checked that, right? These are things because they threw out. By the way, they threw out Republicans in these major areas in Detroit and Pennsylvania and Georgia. They have all the tapes witnessing this. These are all things that conservatives want for an election that liberals say are racist and are suppressing the vote. But in a third world country, they have this, and therefore they have a strong chain of custody. They can secure their elections. But the funny thing is that all the Republicans and the patriots in this country, most of the Republicans and the patriots, they're scared shitless of socialism. But in a socialist country like Nicaragua, they have a more representative democracy than they do in the United States. Go ahead, Wyatt, jump on in.
I was just going to say, it's not a surprise that like the U.S. foreign policy establishment, the deep state, however you want to call it, it's not a surprise that they weren't wanting people to vote in these elections because they don't want people to vote in any elections. They don't like democracy. They don't want anyone like to actually go out and vote, especially not here at home, and not of course not in countries like Nicaragua. They definitely don't want people to vote on Sunday in Venezuela. They don't want people to vote, generally speaking. So, again, like, yeah, for the U.S. to hold itself up as like this big beacon of democracy that everyone else is taking example from, there's no self-awareness there, which is why Joe Biden felt perfectly comfortable comparing the Sandinista and saying there's no difference between the Sandinistas and the Ortega and the Somoza dictatorship that they deposed. It's like, and I made a post about this to the effect of, if that was actually true, then the U.S. would be funding the Sandinistas. They would be supporting the Sandinistas. They would be shipping them hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons instead of trying to overthrow them, like they did, obviously, with the Somoza dictatorship. So, they don't like democracy. They didn't like it in Bolivia 2 years ago or 3 years ago. No, 2 years ago, sorry. They didn't like it then, so they had the OAS intervene, overturn the election so they could jam in, Janine Áñez, who no one had ever heard of, who, as you were saying, I can't remember what you said earlier, but Janine Áñez was, universally unpopular, totally loathed. Another Juan Guaido jam. They don't want democracy. That's how they got rid of Zelaya. That's what you were mentioning about Honduras. Again, this is definitely something we want to be on the lookout for going into the election on the 28th, because Juan Orlando Hernandez is capable of any number of tricks. They they've been operating actual like bot farms for years with the knowledge of Facebook. Facebook has known this about that this is happening. Look the other way for over a year on a troll farm they were operating. They just had another one. Hundreds of totally made up accounts operated for the benefit of the National Party, talking shit about Xiomara Castro. Hundreds of them just got kicked off last week. None of this makes it into the mainstream media. Instead, we hear about like the troll farms in Nicaragua that were actually real people who we met many of them. None of this, of course, is piercing through the mainstream media sort of media blockade, which makes it all the more important that people like us point out these double standards, that we keep doing this important work and trying to speak a little truth to power.
Ahmed, want to wrap it up on this topic, and then we'll get to
you mentioned Janine Áñez.
Go ahead, sorry.
So just to add to Wyatt's point about Janine Áñez, she walked into the presidential palace with a Bible in her hand saying Christianity is back, which is obviously a racist kind of slur to the majority of the Bolivian population, the indigenous population. And people in Nicaragua, they're aware of what's happening in Bolivia. They're aware of what the OS did in Bolivia. They're aware of the figures, the fascistic figures that were supported. And they realize that this is happening here. In Venezuela, the name that was mentioned all the time was Salvador Allende, because they realized what happened in 1973 in Chile. The US was trying to happen here. So they keep doing the same playbook in different contexts, as if we've all got our hands over our eyes and our fingers in our ears, and we don't connect the dots and realize how all these different situations are connected to one another. So yeah, the elections are sham. Is there any election that ever happens in the country that the United States doesn't like, that it thinks is illegitimate? No, there isn't. So it's clear
that's
what it's about. What it's about. Yeah, and in countries that don't have elections, in countries like Saudi Arabia, where they spend $650 million in weapons that don't have elections, they just don't bring it up. They just don't bring it up. It's an inconvenient fact that they'd rather not bring up at all.
That's why I'm so into elections, because I believe it is the vessel for true democracy. It is the vessel for the people's choice. It is the vessel for peace. And also, being an anti-imperialist, seeing what the United States does and the West does, always to manufacture consent, to go into these countries, to interfere, is always about their elections are a sham. Their elections are bullshit. And that's what they attempted to kind of paint the picture of when it came to this election. But all of us were on the ground. All of us went there. We were in different spots. We saw a different thing. We saw the enthusiasm. We saw the expediency. We saw the chain of custody. We saw it unfold. And if America had an election like Nicaragua's election, and the procedures and the framework of Nicaragua was in the West, 95% of that Congress would be gone, because they are never elected. They are always selected. And there are so many ways to fix and fuck with an election. And that's why seeing what we saw in Nicaragua was just a thing of beauty. And I said this to the people of Bilway. I said this to the people of Managua. I said this to the people of Nicaragua as whole. You have an election process to be proud of, because you have a true democracy. Wyatt, why don't you tell everybody where they can find you, what you're working on, what to expect from Wyatt Reed, who's going to fuck with you next, whether it be Keith Olbermann. Maybe you'll get Rachel Maddow's attention. Who you aiming for next, buddy?
Oh, well, that's the dream. You know, I've been dying for that to happen really since the day I opened a Twitter account, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. What I'm working on now, a little bit of a weekly news roundup show that we're going to come out with in the next coming months here at Sputnik. Going to be called Need to Know. If you're still, I'm still here. Yeah. So next couple of weeks, keep an eye out for it. New weekly roundup news show called Need to Know, coming out on Sputnik News. That's definitely main project we're working on here, but we'll see. Hopefully, I may have a chance to go down to report from Honduran elections as well. I'll definitely be letting folks know in the coming days. We'll always be coming up with something good. Got a bunch of new content coming out, interviews with people from Nicaragua. It'll be coming out on my Twitter page. Hopefully an interview with the president's son. Hopefully we've been in contact. So I've got a bunch of questions that I posed to him that I'm hoping to hear some answers back on. Definitely more interviews coming out, just kind of showing how it is that the Sandinista front, the president Daniel Ortega, managed to get 3/4 of the voters to vote for him, not by magic, but by good governance.
He's at Wyatt Reed 13. That's the number 13 on Twitter. Check him out. It's great getting down there with you. Ahmed, where can they find you, and what do you got coming out? Press TV, tell us.
Yeah, so I've got a documentary that I'll be releasing hopefully on Sunday, which is about Sudan and the unfinished revolution. But it talks specifically about how Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, basically, with the support of the United States, stole the revolution from the people and supported these military figures that committed a massacre yesterday on the people of Sudan, where 14 people were shot down on the street. There's been no media coverage. They talk about elections in Nicaragua. They don't care when their military strongmen in the Horn of Africa, in Sudan specifically, massacre people with the support of Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt. And in regards to this documentary, the coup that happened in Sudan, there was this comical article in the Haaretz that said something along the lines of, the United States is calling on Israel to put pressure on Sudan to stop the coup. So this documentary tries to unpack and show how these imperialist powers are using Sudan as a pawn to further their own interests. So that'll be coming out on Sunday, hopefully. I went to Nicaragua to make a documentary, so I'll be in the process of putting that all together. That'll be released hopefully in the next couple of months. And yeah, check out my Twitter page. I'll be posting more videos of stuff that I shot on my phone that I've not had a chance to release as of yet.
And that's at Ahmed Kaballo, AhmedKaballo. If you had an E in the middle there, you'd be Italian, my friend. But Kaballo it is. And you know what? It's really important work you're doing there, my man, because when we started the Convo Couch 4 years ago, I think it was the second or the third show, we talked about African. We talked about Obama bringing the drones over there and then Trump arming them, and that the Congress didn't realize how many troops and bases were in Africa. And with the forced industrial revolution coming in, and now China having influence over there, like in Ethiopia with the dam and stuff, that's the next military industrial playground is Africa. So we need that news from you, my man. So we'll be on the lookout for that. Everybody, that's Wyatt Reed, Ahmed Kaballo, Pastor Jardula from the Convo Couch. This is What the Fuck Are They Talking About in Nicaragua, bringing you the real truth, the real boots on the ground. Check us on out. You know where to find us. We love you all. Convo out, everybody.